offer you guys enormous apologies for being late. Had a personal situation, and then I was detained under Theresa May's new hate preachers law. Arbitrary definition of it, and so winding up on the top 10 list of the Simon Wiesenthal Foundation of anti-Israel, anti-Semites didn't help. That was a joke, but I was just at the Russell Tribunal with two fellow members, Richard Falk and Roger Waters, who both massively defeated me on the race. I was really jealous of them. I'm a Jewish American, so we achieve at really high levels, and I'm trying to become #1 next year. Problem is, Ayatollah Khomeini got #1, so I got stiff competition. What I want to talk about today, and it was my last book that got me on that list. One of the things, actually, the Simon Wiesenthal's Foundation, which is basically a hate group, along with the Anti-Defamation League in the U.S., which would better be known as the Defamation League. But one of the things that, do you have any trouble hearing me at all? I'll speak a little more closely. How's that?
How's that?
It's my voiceover. One of the things they objected to was chapter titles of chapters in my book. My book, Goliath, is about really the consolidation of right-wing power in Israel since 2009, since Israel elected its most right-wing government against the backdrop of Operation Cast Lead, which was the first really major assault on the Gaza Strip since the siege began. And that's going to be a theme of this discussion. And I was documenting incidents and horrors that weren't really being covered in international media, like the race riot in South Tel Aviv against non-Jewish African refugees. This is something that the New York Times maybe covered once, very deep in the newspaper. And African businesses were attacked. Anyone on the street who even looked African was attacked by these right-wing mobs after they were whipped into a frenzy by Miri Regev, who was the Interior Committee chairperson of the Knesset, declaring that Africans were a cancer in Israel's body, an opinion that most Israelis agreed with, according to an Israeli Democracy Institute poll in 2012. The majority of Jewish Israelis also agreed with violence as a solution to expelling the 60,000 non-Jewish African refugees in the country. So I called my chapter The Night of Broken Glass, which was a factual account of the smashing of the glass of African businesses' windows. The streets were littered in glass, but it was also an allusion to Kristallnacht, what happened before the Nazi campaign against Jews and other minorities turned genocidal in an official institutional sense. And it was kind of like a warning. And so I was heavily criticized for that chapter title, for other chapter titles that I thought referred to the factual content of the piece. Now there's a new book out by a liberal Zionist writer in the U.S. Named Richard Cohen. He's a major columnist for the Washington Post who has a history of these kind of statements. And one of the chapters in his book, which is a pro-Israel polemic, is called Ethnic Cleansing for a Better World. It's literally called that. And this is a chapter about how the Nakba was necessary because one superior culture had imposed itself on an inferior one. This is a columnist for the Washington Post. And the same people that attacked my book are promoting his. So that's the kind of environment I'm coming from in the United States, and it's really refreshing to be here and at least be in this side room. In the House of Commons, I don't think I could ever get into the House of Representatives anywhere. I talked to you about Operation Cast Lead being kind of an accelerant for the rise of the right wing in 2009. That's when Netanyahu came into power. And Netanyahu had really presented himself as one of the young Turks of the new right wing in Israel during the late 1980s and early 90s. He attacked his boss and mentor, Yitzhak Shamir, during a speech in 1989 at Bar-Ilan University, and said that Shamir didn't want to do this, but I, as a deputy minister, proposed massive expulsions in the occupied territories while the world was watching Tiananmen Square. It could have gotten so much done there. This is in a public speech. So Netanyahu was showing how much of an extreme rightist he was, while Yitzhak Shamir, who had founded the Stern Gang, who was one of the original forefathers of the right wing, was prime minister. And so Netanyahu comes into power in 2009, but at the hollow center of Israeli politics, with Avigdor Lieberman, the second most popular figure, making similar statements about Netanyahu, serving as foreign minister with the second most popular party, and more right-wing elements poised to come to the fore. So we move forward to this summer. This summer was something that those of us who've been watching Israel-Palestine for a long time haven't seen before. Just the unprecedented scale of violence against the Gaza Strip. My friends in the Gaza Strip, when I was there from August 14th to September, many of them, including the people living in the border areas who are just victims of continuous violence, had never experienced these levels of violence. But there was a context for it. And the context was, first of all, it lay in political events that were occurring earlier in the summer that I'm going to talk about, but also the rise of the right and the religious nationalist faction that came of age in the post-Oslo era, in the era of unilateral separation, with the separation wall built, with Gaza under siege, with Palestinians virtually disappeared from Israeli society, except those who are citizens and are under siege themselves. With a new kind of curriculum in the education system that's based on the notion that there's not going to be peace, that you have to be raised to be a good soldier, not a citizen. We're going to have to occupy indefinitely and perpetuate this separate colonial project one way or another. These are the people who served in the Israeli military during Operation Protective Edge. These are the people who were pushing Netanyahu from the right in ministerial positions. These are the people who are the future of Jewish Israeli society. And this, yes. Well, we'll do Q&A after, but is it? Well, we'll talk about that. There's going to be a lot of time for Q&A. So that's the sort of social backdrop. The political backdrop is the collapse of the peace process, which collapsed with the Kerry Framework Agreement. The peace process collapsed, however, thanks to this new generation of right-wingers and their meddling. That's something that isn't quite widely understood. That if Netanyahu had been in a different coalition, he might have agreed to release the third batch of Palestinian prisoners, which was required to extend negotiations. And Netanyahu's strategy has always been to extend negotiations as long as possible to create as many facts on the ground as he could, because the negotiations keep the status quo in place. That's Netanyahu's goal. But instead, he had not only Avigdor Lieberman, this extreme rightist who favors transfer, but Naftali Bennett, the Jewish Home Party, the quintessential figure of the post-Oslo right-wing generation, who lives inside Israel but wears a knit kippah like a settler, represents the settlers, favors doing away with the two-state solution completely, ending the status quo and subsuming the West Bank, who favors a single unitary apartheid state, and who is an extreme militarist who served in a special operations unit in Lebanon and has bragged, yeah, I killed a lot of Arabs, there's nothing wrong with that, in a cabinet meeting. Bennett and Lieberman combined to reject the prisoner swap, making the extension of the prisoner release, making the extension of the peace process impossible. Netanyahu then went ahead and gave his right-wing coalition what it wanted, which is more settlements, new settlement units in the West Bank. New settlements. Martin Indig, a former researcher from AIPAC, the key arm of the Israel lobby, someone who said that he made aliyah from the UK to the United States to protect Israel's security imperatives. He actually used that term at a pro-Israel meeting in 2009. Martin Indig takes to the Israeli media, goes to Nahum Barnea, the most influential columnist in Israel, and says it was Israel's fault that the negotiations collapsed. It was Netanyahu's fault. Unprecedented for an American negotiator, especially of his profile, to do that. Netanyahu is feeling unprecedented pressure, and then the Palestinian Authority signs the unity agreement with Hamas, sending Netanyahu into a petulant frenzy. He's seeking to reverse the dynamic of the dynamic of just going forward in international diplomacy without a peace process, and the dynamic of Palestinian unity. He's always sought to fragment the Palestinian polity. And so the opportunity arrives on June 12th with the kidnapping of 3 Jewish Israeli teens by a rogue Hamas cell. It's been well established that the kidnappers of these 3 teens are acting without orders from upper-level Hamas cadres. They're acting on their own, and they were probably doing this to spur a prisoner swap because of the blockage of the 3rd batch of Palestinian prisoners. So again, the presence of these right-wingers, these extreme right-wingers, is driving violence. John Kerry goes ahead and blames all of Hamas without evidence, setting the stage for Netanyahu to do the same. And here's the most important thing to understand in this phase, is that no one among the Jewish Israeli public knew what Netanyahu, the Shin Bet, and the police knew, which is that the teens were dead, that they were killed right away, and that they were killed by a rogue Hamas cell consisting of 3 to 5 members and no more. Netanyahu and the police and the Shin Bet had the names of Marwan Kawasme and I think it was Ayman Abu Aisha, who were Abu Aisha, the killers. The teens were buried in a shallow grave on Marwan Kawasme's property. The Kawasme family has a long history of acting in contravention of Hamas political goals despite their Hamas affiliation. And finally, they had a recording one of the teens placed to the Israeli police. You can hear gunshots, bullets and blood were found in the burned getaway car. Netanyahu and the police proceeded to lie to the teens' parents, telling them that there was no blood, no bullets, and that those sounds were blanks in order to deploy them in a global propaganda scheme centered around the hashtag #BringBackOurBoys. One of the parents was sent to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva to plead for the release of her son. But this is one of the most cynical deceptions, and it led straight to the attack on the Gaza Strip. The Israelis believed that their troops had to go on a rescue mission. So thousands and thousands of Israeli troops, including the entire Givati Brigade, were sent into the West Bank for Operation Brother's Keeper. The name invokes a rescue mission, but they weren't going to rescue any teens. They were going to arrest as many people remotely affiliated with Hamas as possible. And as far as Jewish Israelis knew, Hamas could be in any hen house or outhouse or flop house or coffee house in the West Bank. Everything needed to be raided. Birzeit University was raided, and hundreds of Hamas flags were carted away in a truck. And so Hamas's leadership, Haniya and his crew, are in the Gaza Strip watching this with enormous consternation. Their people are being arrested without trial. I think 1/4 of those released in the Gilad Shalit prisoner swap were arrested again, put under administrative detention. Qadr Adnan, who is this hero in the West Bank for the hunger strike he carried out, and Samar Essawi, another hunger striking hero, were arrested as well. To me, seems to be revenge for their successes in getting out of administrative detention with hunger strikes. So anger is increasing in the streets of the West Bank. And then many young Jewish Israelis start taking to Facebook to call for revenge. The People of Israel Demand Revenge was a very popular Facebook page at this time. It got 35,000 likes. And young people who were in the army started posting pictures of themselves with masks on and their weapons, declaring, "We want revenge." This intensified when Netanyahu finally announced the discovery of the 3 teens' bodies. They weren't discovered by the police or by the Shin Bet, which has incredible mapping capacities in the West Bank. They have everything under lock. They have satellites watching everything, but they couldn't find this shallow grave for some reason. It was a bunch of teenage hitchhikers who found the dead bodies. Netanyahu emerges from a cabinet meeting and declares to the Israeli public, "Vengeance for the blood of a small child Satan has not yet created," which is a line from a poem by the Hebrew poet Chaim Bialik about a pogrom committed against Jews in Kishinev in the Pale of Settlement in 1903. So he's invoking the darkest moments of Jewish history and calling for blood vengeance. Against who? All of Hamas is responsible, Netanyahu says. All of Hamas is responsible. So where's Hamas in charge? In the Gaza Strip. Within hours, death to Arabs mobs pour out into the streets of Jerusalem, chanting death to Arabs, chanting Muhammad, a Jew is a soul, an Arab is a son of a bitch. These kind of chants you often hear at Beitar Jerusalem matches. And in fact, Beitar Jerusalem ultras were kind of leading these mobs, but they were also just a random collection of young people. And 3 of them set out for revenge. They first destroyed 20 cars, vandalized 20 cars in Beit Hanina. Then they attempted to capture a 7-year-old boy from his mother's arms, failed, and wound up driving through Shafat, asked the young 19-year-old kid sitting on a ledge outside his home on a corner for directions, grabbed him and threw him in the car. Within an hour, the kid, Mohammed Abu Khader, was dead. He had been burned alive with gasoline poured down his throat. This was an act of revenge, which Netanyahu had helped incite and could have completely avoided if he hadn't manipulated this situation with his cynical deception. But as I said, there was a political backdrop to it all and a social backdrop. Netanyahu had also called those who killed 3 teens human animals. The dehumanization exploded on social media. More teens posting pictures of themselves with weapons. Ayelet Shaked, the whip of the Jewish Home Party, basically the number 2 or 3 figures, Naftali Bennett, declares that we should slaughter Palestinian mothers to prevent them from giving birth to little snakes. The Mohammed Abu Khader's funeral, at his funeral, guns are displayed openly for the first time in East Jerusalem, and gunshots are heard. Shafat is on fire. The light rail line in Shafat, which is used as a conduit for settlers, the kind of people who killed Mohammed Khader, is torched, completely destroyed, and the stage is set for war. Rabbi Noam Perel, the head of B'nai Akiva, which is the largest religious nationalist organization in the world, which has, I think, 300 or 400 yeshivas around the world, invokes the biblical verse Phineas, and calls for 300 Palestinian foreskins, or 300 Palestinians to be killed and their foreskins to be returned as proof, as in the tale of Phineas. I guess they were going to have to go after Christians. So Netanyahu had really lit the flames of revenge against all of Palestinian society, and war on the Gaza Strip became inevitable. Splinter factions in the Gaza Strip, you have to remember, it's not just Hamas that has armed capacity, the capacity to fire rockets, began firing rockets into Israeli territory. And Israel retaliated on July 7th, with a strike on Hamas military leadership, on figures who were very respected within Hamas, killing 7. Hamas's first official launch was actually in my recollection, on July 8th. So you constantly hear about Hamas starting it, but I think we need to look at the beginning of the war as Operation Brother's Keeper, where so many Hamas members were arrested, and at least 6 Palestinians were killed, hundreds were injured. So Hamas launches missiles. One of the rockets was M75 that was launched towards Jerusalem. And in Shafat, where I spent a lot of time, including with the Abu Khader family, this launch was understood as a response to Abu Khader's killing, as retaliation. The next day, Netanyahu authorizes Operation Protected Edge. My friend and colleague David Sheen, the Israeli journalist, did a survey of Israeli social media, and he found that Jewish Israeli teens, pre-army teens at this time, were calling for increased violence on Twitter and on Facebook, mostly young women, because their summer vacations have been disrupted. They're calling for genocide and gas chambers for Palestinians, and saying, damn them, they've wrecked our summer vacation. Avigdor Lieberman, the day that Protected Edge begins, declares that our kids cannot have a normal summer vacation without a ground invasion. 8 days later, the ground invasion comes. The ground invasion arrives in Shujaiya. Shujaiya is an area east of Gaza City, which is in a very tough neighborhood because it borders Israel. So its residents are pretty much constantly being terrorized, and there's this huge buffer zone between them and Israel, which ghettoizes them, prevents them from farming. That's the case for everyone in the border areas of the Gaza Strip, and there is a tunnel network beneath these areas. That's indisputable. Netanyahu goes in saying, we're going to destroy the tunnels. What winds up happening is the Israeli forces go in without adequate armor protection because they expected not much of a fight, as in Operation Cast Lead. They sent their troops in M115 armored personnel carriers, which the U.S. used prior to Vietnam. Hamas's Al-Qassam brigades had been preparing for this fight. They wanted to fight a war that was just targeting Israeli soldiers. They were ready for a ground invasion. They hit those armored personnel carriers with Russian-supplied Kornet missiles, which are armor-piercing anti-tank rockets. They had a few of them. 5 soldiers are killed. This is after Israeli troops had demolished much of the neighborhood, had occupied homes, had sent people fleeing as refugees. So the violence was already extreme. But after this, Israel invokes a policy I'm going to describe to you later, which is designed to prevent the capture of its troops because Al-Qassam announced that they had captured Oron Shaul, one of the Israeli soldiers. He was injured, and we're not sure how he was killed. I went to Shujaiya and interviewed people about what had happened there, and they said, we knew something had happened to one of their soldiers because the F-16 started flying almost literally between the houses in rows of 4. We were hit with every kind of munition we've ever seen: tank shells, mortars, F-16 missiles, drone missiles, Apache helicopter rockets. I interviewed Tamar Atash in his home, and he is someone who helped rescue his neighbors. He was only spared because the missile, the 500-pound missile that fell from an F-16 into his roof, didn't explode. And so as we were speaking, there was a giant hole above us. The missile had been defused and removed the day before. He described to me people leaving, taking this mad dash, using their cell phones for light to get out, watching people jump out of 4-story windows as their homes exploded into flames, watching the entire neighborhood wiped off the map, and running back and forth to rescue more people. Before it was over, almost 200 were dead, and thousands wounded. This was a scene, if you've seen video of it, that really recalls the Nakba. Watching thousands of people pour out of the neighborhood in lorries, children carrying their elderly parents, parents carrying their small children. And for these people, it was before 1948, but in a way it was worse because there was no shelter, no sanctuary, and nowhere to go. And what we saw throughout Operation Protective Edge was the attack on the places where refugees took shelter, the UN schools, hospitals. This was deliberate. This was in contrast to the vigilante revenge operation, which took the life of Mohammed Abu Khudr. It was the official revenge operation for the entire Jewish Israeli public, which supported the war at a rate of 95%, with 45% declaring that the Israeli military did not use enough force. 3%, that 3% fits into the margin of error. I'm going to talk about them in a moment. But let me just describe a few more events in the war. The assault on Gaza was the most grisly assault. This is the border area east of Khan Yunis, and it's where residents were trapped for 6 days under Israeli siege, under the control of the Givati Brigade. Remember, the Givati Brigade is important, and I'll explain why. I met Hani Najjar in Gaza, and he had been one of the fortunate people who escaped. He returned, however, to find 5 corpses in his shower, and 1 in his kitchen. They were handcuffed, they'd been riddled with bullets, their throats had been slit with the knives that he used to slaughter his chickens, and they'd been burned with grenade fire, so that when I arrived there was flesh and dried blood all over the wall. And the story of these killings is still a mystery. They may have been fighters, it may have been civilians. If they were fighters, it's nonetheless a war crime. And Najjar told me that he intends to bulldoze his own home because he can't live there anymore after this incident occurred. And members of his family were trapped and used as human shields, forced to stand on rooftops while Israeli snipers attacked his neighbors. People were shot in their legs while fleeing. People were attacked with tanks while fleeing. Dear Rugela, the 16-year-old epileptic, fell behind her family in her wheelchair as they fled and was blown out of it by a tank shell. I interviewed 2 ICRC volunteers who described to me returning to the town after the slaughter to find an 80-year-old woman still huddled in a chicken coop where she had taken shelter for 8 days and lived off of chicken feed. She was so traumatized she never thought she would ever leave there. These volunteers described to me attempting to coordinate with the Israeli military to get a man off a tree who'd been shot in the leg and tied to a tree. When one of their colleagues got out of the ambulance, he was told to hold up a flashlight, take 5 paces forward, and then shot in the chest and executed in front of them. This is the kind of random violence that people in Gaza faced from the Givati Brigade. And then there was Rafah, where a similar incident occurred as in Shujaiya. Hadar Golden was leading, Lieutenant Hadar Golden happens to be the second cousin of the Israeli defense minister, the elite of the elite, the golden son of the Israeli military, was leading a team from the Paratrooper Brigade 101 from the Givati Brigade to occupy houses just outside of Rafah. Well, half hour before a humanitarian ceasefire was to begin so people could collect the bodies that were already under the rubble. He, in violation, so they were going to violate the ceasefire. A Hamas ambush team emerges from a tunnel, attacks these Israeli soldiers who are occupying the home, attempts to take the wounded Golden down the tunnel. And Commander Ofer Winter, Colonel Ofer Winter, who's the commander of the Givati Brigade, invokes the Hannibal Directive. The Hannibal Directive is the policy that I mentioned before, which is designed to prevent the capture of an Israeli soldier. I described to you at the beginning of the talk, how politically painful it is in Israel to release Palestinian prisoners. So in 1986, the Israeli military drafted this semi-secret doctrine which would allow for disproportionate force to be used not only on the captors of the soldier, but possibly on the soldier himself and on the entire area surrounding where the soldier is. If a soldier is being moved somewhere and you don't exactly know where he is, you have to attack the periphery of the area, which is necessarily in the Gaza Strip, the civilian area. Then beyond that, you have the imperative for revenge among these troops who had gone through the whole experience of the 3 teens and Brothers Keeper. Finally, you have Colonel Ofer Winter, commander of the Givati Brigade, who perfectly embodies the political and psychological sensibility of the right-wing post-Oslo generation that I described to you at the top. He is a religious nationalist from a military yeshiva who represents some of the 40% of the Israeli officer corps who are religious nationalists. He sees the Palestinian population not as enemies, as enemy combatants, but as blasphemers against God. And in a letter to his troops prior to the ground invasion, published in the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv, Winter declared that they were embarking on a holy war to eliminate sin from the Gaza Strip, to eliminate those who sin against God. So Winter is the one who invoked the Hannibal Directive. And when the Hannibal Directive took place, it led to what residents in Rafah refer to as Black Friday, August 1st, 2014. Every kind of munition possible fell on the city and its outskirts, not even anywhere near where Golden was taken. What people described to me was a horror show. Naval shelling, tank shelling, artillery, mortars. People that I met were using spent mortar shells as ashtrays. They were so prolific in this area. Bulldozers ripping down walls. I met one family who had miraculously evacuated from their home to the Al-Najjar hospital, and they, as soon as they arrived with wounded, were evacuated from the hospital along with every single person in the hospital because Israel threatened to bomb the hospital, and they ultimately did. They were sent to the Kuwaiti hospital, which has 20 beds. It's an OBGYN and dental clinic, which was the only medical facility left in Rafah. And there I met Dr. Samir Holmes, who told me of performing operations in the hallways, on the floor, performing amputations in the waiting room, in dental chairs, and having to call corner stores, local grocery stores, for ice cream coolers to store the bodies of dead children in. The image of a dead child in an ice cream cooler, to me, is the image of Operation Protective Edge and the natural outcome of Netanyahu's incitement to blood revenge. Back in Israel, there was a group, 3% within the margin of error, who attempted to protest, raise their voices against the war in the public squares in Tel Aviv. And they described to me, these are people who I know many of them very well. I mean, it's always the same few people you see. Many of you probably know them too. And they described to me not only unprecedented violence wielded against them by right-wing mobs, but unprecedented organization by those right-wingers. I mean, the right-wingers have been preparing not only to seize political positions, to take the officer corps in the military. A religious nationalist is now the head of the Shin Bet for the first time. So they're infiltrating the institutions, but they're also preparing to take the public squares, shut down dissent. And that is what they substantially managed to do. And the organization took place partly through the ultras of Beitar Jerusalem, the favorite football team of the right wing, owned by a friend of Avigdor Lieberman, by the Maccabi Tel Aviv ultras, some of whom were wearing shirts that read "Good Night, Left Side." And if you're an anti-fascist activist in the UK, you might have seen these shirts. They're traditionally worn by neo-Nazis. They're worn by white supremacists in California. And they made their way to Israel finally. And they were led by a coalition of random people, part of them led by Mikhail Ben-Ari, who was a former student and lieutenant of Meir Kahane, the racist rabbi who was assassinated, who served briefly in Knesset and advocated for ethnic cleansing and many policies like loyalty oaths that have been signed into law. Ben-Ari was in the Knesset for 2 years, and he used the money, the government money he got, to set up field offices that were used as hubs of organizing for the anti-African refugee movement and for the anti-miscegenation movement called Lehava, which carries out vigilante activity to prevent Jewish-Arab relationships. In other words, to prevent Jewish women from having contact with Arab men, which most recently protested a Jewish-Arab wedding in a really disgusting fashion. So you have Ben-Ari embodying the most violent wing of the settlement movement, and then a rapper named The Shadow, who was once one of the most popular rappers in Israel. He's a right-wing rapper who completely upends the whole mentality of hip-hop and make songs that revere the military, that lionize cops, that urge you not to drink and smoke. At his shows during the Second Intifada, alongside the rapper Subliminal, the cry of death to Arabs would be heard from the crowd. And this is a completely unfamiliar scene to someone who, like me, who grew up going to hip-hop shows in New York and watching NBC and seeing the kind of racial unity that embodied the ethos of hip-hop. So The Shadow had a massive following on Facebook, and he called in a sort of impromptu post for traitors to be assaulted, meaning leftists. The response was so massive that he decided to formalize his Facebook page as an organizing hub for attacking left-wing demonstrations. He called it Order Number 8. And whenever he declared Order Number 8, which is the order given to reservists when they're called up for service, people knew where the leftists were and where to attack them. And many of the leftists described to me checkpoints being set up outside their demonstrations, as in the West Bank, by young men who knew how to do that because they were reservists. I went to a demonstration in Lod, and it was there was a right-wing counter-demonstration, and near the right-wing counter-demonstration was a car filled with young men who looked to me like soldiers, and they asked me if there were any fights. They were looking for a fight. And they've kind of been sent behind these local demonstrators as muscle, it appeared. So there was organization, photographs were taken of activists and put online, and they were followed home after the first anti-war demonstration in Tel Aviv. 4 were followed home individually and beaten in front of their doorsteps. Dozens of people were fired from their jobs after being outed on Facebook as leftists or opponents of the war. Most of them were Palestinian citizens of Israel who worked in government jobs, who expressed opposition privately on Facebook to the war. Gideon Levy, the most prominent dissident columnist in Israel, criticized the Israeli Air Force, the cream of the crop of the Israeli military, and said, they're committing war crimes. And they were responsible for the bulk of atrocities, indeed. Levy was bombarded with so many death threats that Haaretz has to pay for a bodyguard to follow him 24/7. Hanin Zouabi, the most hated woman in Israel, the Palestinian Israeli legislator, was finally suspended from the Knesset for 6 months. The dream of the right wing realized. She was silent. For an interview, comments she made in an interview where she said the kidnappers weren't terrorists necessarily. They were embodying some grievance. And she also was put on trial for assaulting an officer in a really bizarre charge. Many Israeli reporters, including major figures and pundits, were threatened and faced physical threats for perceived opposition to the war. A number were supporters of the war and were nearly attacked by mobs coming out of Channel 2's and Channel 1's offices. So the hysteria grew so extreme that even supporters of the war felt threatened. Towards the end of the war, after the ground invasion, I was going between the Gaza Strip, and I would come out and be in Jerusalem. And I noticed that the Lahava organizing tables in the center of Jerusalem, where they would organize and hand out leaflets to recruit young people to the anti-miscegenation movement, weren't as active. I noticed that the banners calling for solidarity with the families of the 3 teens were tattered. The Israeli Air Force continued to pound the Gaza Strip. In the end, they dropped 500 tons of munitions on the Gaza Strip, in contrast to the 50 they dropped on it in Operation Cast Lead. This is more than the U.S. dropped on Hiroshima in World War II. In the end, they destroyed Zafar 4 and the Italian compound and Basha Tower, 3 of the oldest and most stately residential towers of the Gaza Strip with no military value. They did so during ceasefire negotiations to demonstrate what they could do. In the end, they left over 2,000 dead and thousands wounded. And when I returned to the Gaza Strip, I found people walking around with nothing to do all day because they had no home and no shelter to return to, many of them with injuries. In the end, they left over 7.5% of the Gaza Strip crippled with severe injuries from the Israeli military. This is cumulative. And in the end, it seemed that Netanyahu's approval rating had gone up to unprecedented levels, while Naftali Bennett stood to gain 5 seats in the next election, eating in not only to Netanyahu and the Likud party's popularity, but completely caving in the center party, Yesh Atid, showing who is going to possibly be the next prime minister. In the end, a stalemate ensued in the ceasefire, but Israel, the Jewish Israeli society that demanded this assault, finally seemed to be content. Ofer Winter said in an interview with Yediot Aharonot, the commander of the Givati Brigade, there were no civilians in the Gaza Strip. Every home had a bomb in it. How can you raise children to be terrorists? He boasted, we shredded them. He declared that the war was a war between light and darkness. And he said that what we've accomplished with this war has bought us a few years until the next war. And there will be a next war. But for now, at least, the people of Israel, quote unquote, people of Israel, had had their revenge. Thanks a lot. I saw first one over here.
Yeah, just to say that wonderful account, and thank you very much indeed for coming over and giving us your first-hand, fantastic and brilliant witness account of what happened over there.
Thank you.
What would you give us a suggestion as to what we here in London can do about it?
Well, there's only one thing that you can do. Israel needs to be pressured to end the project of settler colonial apartheid, which made this attack and will make future attacks possible, which requires the ghettoization of the Gaza Strip and other areas. And the US-led peace process was never a recipe for ending this system. We have to understand the Gaza Strip in a wider context. 80% of its residents are refugees. That's why UNRWA has to care for everyone, and now UNRWA has to pay 4 months' rent for everyone who's homeless. Why are they refugees? It's because they're not allowed to go back to the homes that they and their ancestors were forced to leave inside what is now Israel proper. Why can't they go back? Because they're not Jews. They don't have J-positive blood like I do. I could become a citizen of Israel today if I wanted, because of my right of return to a place with which I have about as much connection to as the San Francisco-based Creedence Clearwater does to the bayou. According to this system, I have more rights in Israel, in all of Israel-Palestine, than any Palestinian in this room or in the world, just because of the circumstances of my birth. And no settler colonial society has ever changed from within. They only change from without. They're forced to change, and it's a question of what kind of force is used. And so there is a tactic that is pressuring Israel to make this change, and it's the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS. It's a nonviolent movement that emphasizes the participation of citizens like you and the role you can play in pressuring your government to sanction, in organizing boycotts in your community, and pressuring performers not to play the new Sun City, Tel Aviv. And Israel has to be told you're not normal, and you won't be treated as normal until the people under your control have rights. And that's the essence of it, and I know there are people here who can tell you more about how you can get involved, but I've come to the conclusion that for us out here in the West, this is the only game in town. Yeah.
I'm another apparently self-hating Jew, and I'm in constant battle with people I call Israel slaves on Facebook. A lot of them, I'm afraid, have to be in the USA. You mentioned a figure which I've been using of 2,000 dead in this war, 2,000 Palestinians. And they always challenge this and they immediately say, oh, Hamas killed most of these, misfire rockets, they killed their own people, blah, blah, blah. What do I say to them? What ammunition can I use against this that you can give me?
Well, I am self-hating. Being Jewish has nothing to do with it. I stole that from either Woody Allen or Larry David. Now it's like saying Shema, it's like you just say that. So welcome to the self-haters of Zion, or like we call ourselves. But you don't say anything to them. You just don't talk to them. You can't talk to Ziontologists. It's like a cult. And they have a cultish way of looking at the world which helps them to go forward in their daily lives and believe that when they look in the mirror, they're still decent, humane people. And it requires this kind of propaganda, which is, when someone has gone that far, there's very little that you can do. There are a lot of Jews I know in the U.S. who are on the fence, and they recognize that Palestinians suffer massively, but they tend to come from more communal Jewish environments than I do, and they just have trouble taking on a perspective that they know they want to take on and accepting the consequences with their families and their friends and their community. And those are the people we should be helping along, saying, you can still be a Jew and heed the prophetic voice, which is the bedrock of Judaism. And you can be a Jew and still be a model for other Jews like you who want to be humane, decent people. You don't have to be a Zionist to be a Jew, but this merger of Zionism and Judaism has been disastrous and has led to a moral freefall across the world, and there are some people that we're just not going to be able to reach. And that's a tragedy.
Sorry. Yes, just on your point there of Scientologists.
Ziontology.
Yeah. I think,
Ram Netanyahu.
I believe, because I've been in discussion with a couple of young people within Israel, and I think as well as supporting the Palestinians, I think it's a good thing to change the plan, because if I'm doing it with one or two young people in Israel and they're listening, there's probably a few more thousand out in the world doing the same thing, and I think that's a great thing to change the plan, you know, for Zionism.
What's important, a lot of my Jewish Israeli friends who are now against the occupation are really committed to fighting apartheid from within. A lot of them weren't always that way. One of my good friends, Leah Tarachansky, grew up on a settlement, and she grew up in Ariel, and she said that she had not met a Palestinian until she went to school in Canada and started meeting people who challenged her perspective, and she came back kind of an anti-Zionist. And I think she's doing some of the most important work right now with her weekly reports for The Real News. TheRealNews.com is a really good outlet, and she's just released a documentary on the myths of Israeli society that she grew up on, the myths of the Nakba, that are so dangerous psychologically. The problem is that individuals like you and I can't challenge the institutions in Israeli life, which are indoctrinating Jewish Israeli youth at rates that are far higher than we can deprogram them at, without something like BDS. The army is the main institution of indoctrination. Israel is the most militarized culture in the world. That's why I spend so much time in my book, Goliath, writing about the education system and the militarization process that occurs starting at age 4. And I wrote about a preschool in Holon, which is near Tel Aviv, where preschoolers, this is not a religious nationalist school, are lined up before a board and they're presented with the question, who wants to kill us? Then the answer is provided. The traditional enemies of the Jewish people, from the Egyptians to the Persians to the Arabs to the Nazis, of course. And then another question is provided to them, what do we need? The answer, a state. And what kind of state? I mean, of course, we need an exclusively Jewish state without those kind of people in it. How do you achieve that? Well, those people are there, and in 14 years, you're going to be in the Israeli army going into the West Bank, or many young women go into air-conditioned offices in the Negev desert and operate remote-controlled machine guns that are posted on the walls that line the Gaza ghetto, or help man drones. So you're going to do something like that. How do you get into the frame of mind to do that? You have to be indoctrinated. This is the price of maintaining a settler colonial system. 25% or more of Jewish Israelis have been taken on these March of the Living trips to Auschwitz, which are used to really manipulate the lessons of the Holocaust to promote a segregationist perspective. The education ministry in Israel measures the attitudes that they take into these trips before and after, and find that these trips increase nationalistic and attitudes and support for the military, which is their goal. You should see the movie Defamation. I think it's one of the finest documentaries about anti-Semitism and the Israeli education system. So I think removing these institutions from Israeli life will really promote, will open space for actual democracy. But what can we do to challenge them? I mean, it's possible to talk to Jewish Israelis sometimes on the outside if they're questioning, but that's not going to be enough to create a change. I thought yours was the first, and then we'll start taking the groups so we get to everyone.
What's your thoughts on the Israeli influence in American foreign policy right now? I know this has been proposed by Meishan, who's discussed this on the influence that they have, of course, in the Iraq war as well.
So I think I get the gist of the question, which is the impact of Israeli influence on U.S. foreign policy. Let's get this one in as well.
What do you think of the idea proposed by Lenin sometime in 1928, providing an autonomous Jewish region where there weren't any Palestinians or anybody else near Birobidzhan, near Vladivostok? Looks like if you look at it on the internet, it's a lovely looking place.
Well, I've gotten that question a lot, and I've never gotten that one before. So let's start with the one I've gotten a lot. I mean, obviously, the influence of the Israel lobby on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is enormous. I don't think there's any debate on that. I mean, Netanyahu is pushing it as far as he can, pushing the limits with Obama. But I mean, it's interesting to watch what happened this week. The Jerusalem municipality authorized settlers to take over 25 homes in Silwan in this occupied area near the old city in East Jerusalem, basically throwing families out of their homes, which is a war crime. It's not, just something that's against international law. It's a war crime. And Obama met for an hour with Netanyahu, who had just finished sharing values with Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, who is very similar to Netanyahu, not only in his neoliberalism, but also in his record of atrocities, and the adulation he receives from the diaspora. And so Obama emerges from the meeting and immediately condemns Netanyahu for taking over these Palestinian homes. And what consequence will he apply? Absolutely none. Absolutely none. It's all words with Obama and with Washington. Washington allowed Netanyahu and his people to really shape the framework agreement that Kerry offered them that they rejected. And it's their way of always moving things further to the right and testing the limits of what they can get out of Washington. They've seen the worst we're going to get is a statement of concern. And I think now Washington signs its checks to Israel with deep concern. This relationship has real consequences, as I saw, and I'll give you one example, as I saw in the Gaza Strip. Netanyahu used Sheldon Adelson, the owner of the Venetian casino in Las Vegas, to fund Mitt Romney's campaign to oust Obama, because he believed that Mitt Romney would have a greater chance of attacking Iran. Israel wants to attack Iran, but it just doesn't have the capacity to do so. Didn't have bunker buster bombs, and it may have even had to have used tactical nuclear weapons to penetrate the deeply embedded nuclear facilities in Iran. Only the U.S. can do it, and also only the U.S. had in-air refueling capacity. Israel's building this relationship with Azerbaijan so it can get its Air Force bases to possibly attack Iran. Netanyahu loses, because Romney loses. And Obama needs to mollify Netanyahu to prevent him from doing something crazy. So he gives him 18,000 GBUs, which are bunker buster bombs. They're 5,000-pound bombs. And it's a way of just saying, get off our back, man. And he gives him more money for the Iron Dome. Those two were seminal weapons in this attack, and if you went to the Gaza Strip, you would see homes turned into swimming pools by 5,000-pound bombs. What do you need 5,000-pound bombs for in a civilian area? So by mollifying Netanyahu, this is my personal opinion, it's like, people will dispute this, but in this effort to mollify Israel, to keep the special relationship going, Obama and his people ratcheted up the civilian death toll in the Gaza Strip enormously. I mean, 5,000-pound bombs on civilian apartment blocks and offices. So the hysteria grew so extreme that even supporters of the war felt threatened. Towards the end of the war, after the ground invasion, I was going between the Gaza Strip, and I would come out and be in Jerusalem. And I noticed that the Lahava organizing tables in the center of Jerusalem, where they would organize and hand out leaflets to recruit young people to the anti-miscegenation movement, weren't as active. I noticed that the banners calling for solidarity with the families of the 3 teams were tattered. The Israeli Air Force continued to pound the Gaza Strip. In the end, they dropped 500 tons of munitions on the Gaza Strip, in contrast to the 50 they dropped on it in Operation Castellet. This is more than the U.S. dropped on Hiroshima in World War II. In the end, they destroyed Zafar 4 and the Italian compound and Basha Tower, 3 of the oldest and most stately residential towers of the Gaza Strip with no military value. They did so during ceasefire negotiations to demonstrate what they could do. In the end, they left over 2,000 dead and thousands wounded. And when I returned to the Gaza Strip, I found people walking around with nothing to do all day because they had no home and no shelter to return to, many of them with injuries. In the end, they left over 7.5% of the Gaza Strip crippled with severe injuries from the Israeli military. This is cumulative. And in the end, it seemed that Netanyahu's approval rating had gone up to unprecedented levels, while Naftali Bennett stood to gain 5 seats in the next election, eating in not only to Netanyahu and the Likud party's popularity, but completely caving in the center party, Yesh Atid, showing who is going to possibly be the next prime minister. In the end, a stalemate ensued in the ceasefire, but Israel, the Jewish Israeli society that demanded this assault, finally seemed to be content. Ofer Winter said in an interview with Yediot Aharonot, the commander of the Givati Brigade, there were no civilians in the Gaza Strip. Every home had a bomb in it. How can you raise children to be terrorists? He boasted, we shredded them. He declared that the war was a war between light and darkness. And he said that what we've accomplished with this war has bought us a few years until the next war. And there will be a next war. But for now, at least, the people of Israel, quote unquote, people of Israel, had had their revenge. Thanks a lot. Question I saw first over here.
Yeah, just to say that wonderful account, and thank you very much indeed for coming over and giving us your first-hand, fantastic and brilliant witness account of what happened over there.
Thank you.
What would you give us as a suggestion as to what we here in London can do about it?
Well, there's only one thing that you can do. Israel needs to be pressured to end the project of settler colonial apartheid, which made this attack and will make future attacks possible, which requires the ghettoization of the Gaza Strip and other areas. And the US-led peace process was never a recipe for ending this system. We have to understand the Gaza Strip in a wider context. 80% of its residents are refugees. That's why UNRWA has to care for everyone, and now UNRWA has to pay 4 months' rent for everyone who's homeless. Why are they refugees? It's because they're not allowed to go back to the homes that they and their ancestors were forced to leave inside what is now Israel proper. Well, why can't they go back? Because they're not Jews. They don't have J-positive blood like I do. I could become a citizen of Israel today if I wanted, because of my right of return to a place with which I have about as much connection to as the San Francisco-based Creedence Clearwater does to the bayou. According to this system, I have more rights in Israel, in all of Israel-Palestine, than any Palestinian in this room or in the world, just because of the circumstances of my birth. And no settler colonial society has ever changed from within. They only change from without. They're forced to change, and it's a question of what kind of force is used. And so there is a tactic that is pressuring Israel to make this change, and it's the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. BDS. It's a nonviolent movement that emphasizes the participation of citizens like you and the role you can play in pressuring your government to sanction, in organizing boycotts in your community, and pressuring performers not to play the new Sun City, Tel Aviv. And Israel has to be told you're not normal, and you won't be treated as normal until the people under your control have rights. And that's the essence of it, and I know there are people here who can tell you more about how you can get involved, but I've come to the conclusion that for us out here in the West, this is the only game in town. Yeah.
I'm another apparently self-hating Jew, and I'm in constant battle with people I call Israel slaves on Facebook. A lot of them, I'm afraid, happen to be in the USA. You mentioned a figure, which I've been using, of 2,000 dead in this war, 2,000 Palestinians. And they always challenge this and immediately say, oh, Hamas killed most of these misfired rockets, they kill their own people, blah, blah, blah. What do I say to them? What ammunition can I use against this nonsense that you can give them, please?
Well, I am self-hating. Being Jewish has nothing to do with it. I stole that from either Woody Allen or Larry David. Now it's like saying the Shema. It's like you just say that. So welcome to the self-haters of Zion, or what we call ourselves. But you don't say anything to them. You just don't talk to them. You can't talk to Ziontologists. It's like a cult, and they have a cultish way of looking at the world which helps them to go forward in their daily lives and believe that when they look in the mirror, they're still decent, humane people. And it requires this kind of propaganda, which is, when someone has gone that far, there's very little that you can do. There are a lot of Jews I know in the U.S. who are on the fence, and they recognize that Palestinians suffer massively, but they tend to come from more communal Jewish environments than I do, and they just have trouble taking on a perspective that they know they want to take on and accepting the consequences with their families and their friends and their community. And those are the people we should be helping along, saying, you can still be a Jew and heed the prophetic voice, which is the bedrock of Judaism. And you can be a Jew and still be a model for other Jews like you who want to be humane, decent people. You don't have to be a Zionist to be a Jew, but this merger of Zionism and Judaism has been disastrous, and has led to a moral freefall across the world, and there are some people that we're just not going to be able to reach. That's a tragedy.
Sorry. Yes, just on your point there of Scientologists.
Ziontology.
Yeah. I think
Elron Netanyahu.
I believe, because I've been in a discussion with a couple of young people within Israel, and I think as well as supporting the Palestinians, I think it's a good thing to change within, because if I'm doing it with one or two young people within Israel and they're listening, there's probably a few more thousand out in the world that's doing the same thing, and I think that's a great thing to change things, what Zionism and Judaism.
Well, it's important, a lot of my Jewish Israeli friends who are now against the occupation are really committed to fighting apartheid from within. A lot of them weren't always that way. One of my good friends, Leah Tarachansky, grew up on a settlement, and she grew up in Ariel, and she said that she had not met a Palestinian until she went to school in Canada and started meeting people who challenged her perspective, and she came back kind of an anti-Zionist. And I think she's doing some of the most important work right now with her weekly reports for The Real News. TheRealNews.com is a really good outlet, and she's just released a documentary on the myths of Israeli society that she grew up on, the myths of the Nakba, that are so dangerous psychologically. The problem is that individuals like you and I can't challenge the institutions in Israeli life, which are indoctrinating Jewish Israeli youth at rates that are far higher than we can deprogram them at, without something like BDS. The army is the main institution of indoctrination. Israel is the most militarized culture in the world. That's why I spend so much time in my book, Goliath, writing about the education system and the militarization process that occurs starting at age 4. And I wrote about a preschool in Holon, which is near Tel Aviv, where preschoolers, this is not a religious nationalist school, are lined up before a board and they're presented with a question, who wants to kill us? Then the answer is provided. The traditional enemies of the Jewish people, from the Egyptians to the Persians to the Arabs to the Nazis, of course. And then another question is provided to them, what do we need? The answer, a state. And what kind of state? I mean, of course, we need an exclusively Jewish state without those kind of people in it. How do you achieve that? Well, those people are there, and in 14 years, you're going to be in the Israeli army going into the West Bank, or many young women go into air-conditioned offices in the Negev desert and operate remote-controlled machine guns that are posted on the walls that line the Gaza ghetto, or help man drones. So you're going to do something like that. How do you get into the frame of mind to do that? You have to be indoctrinated. This is the price of maintaining a settler colonial system. 25% or more of Jewish Israelis have been taken on these March of the Living trips to Auschwitz, which are used to really manipulate the lessons of the Holocaust to promote a segregationist perspective. The education ministry in Israel measures the attitudes that they take into these trips before and after, and find that these trips increase attitudes and support for the military, which is their goal. You should see the movie Defamation. I think it's one of the finest documentaries about anti-Semitism and the Israeli education system. So I think removing these institutions from Israeli life will really promote, will open space for actual democracy. But what can we do to challenge them? I mean, it's possible to talk to Jewish Israelis sometimes on the outside if they're questioning, but that's not going to be enough to create a change. I thought yours was the first, and then we'll start taking them in groups so we can get to everyone.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you. Very interesting talk. I was just wondering, what's your thoughts on the Israeli influence on American foreign policy right now? I know this has been obviously by Meir Shiner, and of course, Trump has discussed this, the influence that they had, of course, in the Iraq war and whatnot. I'm sure you're familiar with Obed Yenin, of course. It goes back to the 1980s, of course, who was with the Israeli government, and they devised the theory of organising member states in the region which were considered to be a threat to Israeli and American dominance in the region. And of course, going into Iraq, of course, they Dick Cheney, of course, in 2003, and then the cakewalk with that every region's liberators and whatnot. Then back to 1994, of course, because that's why we go after Jersey.
So I think I get the gist of the question, which is the impact of Israeli influence on U.S. foreign policy. Let's get this one in as well.
What do you think of the idea proposed by Lenin in 1928 of providing an autonomous Jewish region where there weren't any Palestinians or anybody else near Azerbaijan, near Vladivostok? That's what Jews there now. It looks like, if you look at it on the internet, it's a lovely looking place. It wouldn't solve all this problem without any religious or military consequences.
Well, I've gotten that question a lot, and I never got that one before. So let's start with the one I've gotten a lot. I mean, obviously, the influence of the Israel lobby on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is enormous. I don't think there's any debate on that. I mean, Netanyahu is pushing it as far as he can, pushing the limits with Obama. But I mean, it's interesting to watch what happened this week. The Jerusalem municipality authorized settlers to take over 25 homes in Silwan, in this occupied area near the old city in East Jerusalem, basically throwing families out of their homes, completely, which is a war crime. It's not, just something that's against international law. It's a war crime. And Obama met for an hour with Netanyahu, who had just finished sharing values with Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, who is very similar to Netanyahu, not only in his neoliberalism, but also in his record of atrocities, and the adulation he receives from the diaspora. And so Obama emerges from the meeting and immediately condemns Netanyahu for taking over these Palestinian homes. And what consequence will he apply? Absolutely none. Absolutely none. It's all words with Obama and with Washington. Washington allowed Netanyahu and his people to really shape the framework agreement that Kerry offered them and that they rejected. And it's their way of always moving things further to the right and testing the limits of what they can get out of Washington. They've seen the worst we're going to get is a statement of concern. And I think now Washington signs its checks to Israel with deep concern. This relationship has real consequences, as I saw, and I'll give you one example, as I saw in the Gaza Strip. Netanyahu used Sheldon Adelson, the owner of the Venetian casino in Las Vegas, to fund Mitt Romney's campaign to oust Obama, because he believed that Mitt Romney would have a greater chance of attacking Iran. Israel wants to attack Iran, but it just doesn't have the capacity to do so. Didn't have bunker buster bombs, and it may have even had to have used tactical nuclear weapons to penetrate the deeply embedded nuclear facilities in Iran. Only the US could do it, and also only the US had in-air refueling capacity. Israel's building this relationship with Azerbaijan so it can get its Air Force bases to possibly attack Iran. Netanyahu loses because Romney loses, and Obama needs to mollify Netanyahu to prevent him from doing something crazy. So he gives him 18,000 GBUs, which are bunker buster bombs. They're 5,000-pound bombs, and it's a way of just saying, get off our back, man. Then he gives him more money for the Iron Dome. Those two were seminal weapons in this attack, and if you went to the Gaza Strip, you would see homes turned into swimming pools by 5,000-pound bombs. What do you need 5,000-pound bombs for in a civilian area? So by mollifying Netanyahu, this is my personal opinion, it's like, people will dispute this, but in this effort to mollify Israel, to keep the special relationship going, Obama and his people ratcheted up the civilian death toll in the Gaza Strip enormously. I mean, 5,000-pound bombs on civilian apartment blocks and homes, that's unheard of. And the sound of it was just massive. And then, on this question of a Jewish autonomous area, I mean, you have to go back to the mindset of people in Europe in 1928, which was not a very healthy mindset to even envision such a thing. I mean, it was the same mindset that envisioned colonialism in India and Africa. I really reject the idea of ethnically unique autonomous zones, although obviously, if Zionism had been manifested in a place where there was no indigenous people, they might have got along better. I just don't think it would have really worked out as well. I mean, part of the persistence of Israel is its ability to define itself against another. Part of its success in fundraising among American Jews is to be embattled. Jewish Americans who are turning secular, who are wealthy, need something to support. And what better to support than a people that are embattled and surrounded by these barbarian enemies? If the occupation ended and Israel was at peace, they wouldn't donate at as great rates. You can just see that in the pro-Israel organizations' appeals to their donors. Finally, if there was to be a Jewish autonomous area and it had to be anywhere, well, it should have been in Germany. I mean, why did the Palestinians have to suffer for what the Germans did?
Absolutely.
Palestinians are indirect victims of the Holocaust, and Germany should pay them reparations immediately.
Sorry, can I just interrupt there? Because I've always had this idea that I'm originally Belgian, okay? And our only should have been a strip of Europe given from France through Belgium, through Germany, all the way to Poland and to Lithuania, because really, it's not actually just the Germans. A hell of a lot of other Europeans collaborated. Most of the worst capos in Nazi camps were Lithuanians. And it's actually all of Europe was responsible for this. My point is certainly not to make Palestinians responsible for it. It's definitely not their problem. I didn't think the Holocaust was solely a German problem. There's a huge amount of European denial.
I agree completely. I was just making a rhetorical point. But you know, the best thing to do is just Israelis, and there was an anti-Semitism demonstration in Berlin, and Jewish Israeli leftists came out and chanted, "Don't give us weapons, give us passports." Give them passports. And why can't Germany start treating Jews as normal people instead of special people who deserve special treatment and need need Dolphin-class submarines? I think that's a form of anti-Semitism. The attitude of Germans, which is philo-Semitic, is as dangerous as the attitude that's anti-Semitic. Treat Jews like you treat anyone else. Plus.
So it was known fairly early on, and having been there, I wondered, when it came out, was there no public response within Israel about what those families had gone through, thinking that these boys had died and their bodies hadn't been found? Like, that's, I find it curious that that narrative has never really been picked up anywhere, certainly not here. So was it there? Was it, I mean, did people talk about that? Was there some outrage about the cynicism of it? Or?
Next question. No, I'm going to answer them too.
Well, just to sort of use Mark Leggett's terminology, what other country in the world has something like 15% of its population living abroad, and a big percentage also holding passports to abroad? What I'm getting at is the brittleness of that society and the actual lack of centre to it in any sense of continuity, any sense that they actually sensibly could go on living there, which must be, I think that kind of outlook is quite a fueling thing for genocide. The extremity of what they feel, genuinely feel, because they've been told to and they've been brought up to it, is actually the sort of the other side of the coin to the extremity of what they do. You see what I'm
I completely see what you're saying, absolutely.
The genocidal attitudes.
Yeah, no, that's it. But let me get to this one first, this question first. The whereabouts of the teens, the identities of the killers, as I said, were known by the, I don't know about the whereabouts that they knew where their bodies were, but Netanyahu and his inner circle knew they were dead. They knew the names of the people who were most likely to have killed them, but this was kept from the Israeli public by a gag order. And so journalists who had heard the phone call, if they had revealed details of the phone call by one of the teens to the Israeli police, would have been court-martialed if they had revealed it. It was actually Mondoweiss, an excellent US site, that revealed the contents of the phone call with the help of an Israeli reporter in an unbylined article that was totally ignored in US media by the idiotic Jerusalem Bureau of the New York Times, which doesn't even want to explore these kind of deceptions. So no one in the Israeli public knew for about 2 weeks because of the gag order. And that increased, it ratcheted up the desire for revenge, the anger, and gave Netanyahu political space to do Operation Brother's Keeper. So when the bodies were discovered, then you have the the release of all of the pent-up anger. And you know, if you looked at the interactions on my Twitter account, I was being blamed for killing these 3 teens somehow, just because I'm like this big, scary anti-Zionist. People were just looking for someone to attack who were part of this mob mentality. At that point, you're not really thinking about, were we deceived? You know, have we been lied to? It's like Americans during the run-up to the war in Iraq. And there haven't been any tough questions that I've seen over that, or over the Hannibal Directive, or over these other areas where Israelis were deceived during the war. I haven't seen any reflection. And you raise a really important point. Israel is a settler colonial society. It has one of the highest percentages of its population living abroad of any country in the world, and the other countries that have comparable populations are like Sri Lanka and Mexico. I mean, northern Mexico, thanks to our war on drugs, is a failed state. It's completely destabilized. Israel has a different problem. You know, it's implanted itself in an area where it can't seem to normalize relations with its neighbors because it is positioned towards Europe with a European mentality and a back full of armor. Its goal is to prevent what it calls Levantinization. In other words, to become part of the region. And I think that's ultimately the solution. So if you have no political solution, and you go decade after decade after decade with war after war after war, and you're a young person and you're conscripted into the military, it's frustrating. You don't want to do it. Why can't you be normal? The Palestinians won't let us be normal. That's what I get when I interview soldiers. And in my book, I wrote a chapter about a visit I made to a military base in the West Bank. I got in kind of posing as a human rights worker, facilitator with other human rights facilitators, and got to listen to the border police, these young people who are, you know, on the front lines of the occupation, doing the bulk of house-to-house raids in the West Bank, like disgusting kind of police work that they hate, complaining about their job. And one of them, who was the only ideological volunteer to the unit, told me, you know, we just need a strong leader who will finally push the button. Because we're going about this day by day very slowly, but we need to get it over with. And I said, what do you mean get it over with? Like kill them all? He said, yeah, kill them all, because we're just killing them slowly now. And it's that frustration of having to maintain an occupation perpetually without an end that leads to these genocidal attitudes and requires more and more indoctrination to inculcate more and more young people into the maintenance of this anachronistic project. And then there are the people who just leave. I would want to leave. All of my leftist friends, except one that I can think of, are making plans to leave after this attack. Here and here, and we'll get back here. Yeah.
Thank you for your compassion. I'm a Palestinian. I'm a writer, and I've written volumes about Israel and Palestine. What I am interested in now, if I may steal the conversation, is the Russell Tribunal, because we know we cannot defeat Israel militarily. We cannot defeat them in the United Nations because they have the veto of America, always. Because Mr. Abbas is dragging his feet to go to the ICC, from your inner knowledge of the Russell Tribunal, do you see a shortcut that any of us here, or any government that called Israel genocide, going to ICC by passing America and the DA?
Okay, well, I'll get to this one.
Well, Hamas, they joined the government in 2014, in which there were EU and US stipulations where they had to accept the state of Israel. So if, by signing that, they accepted the state of Israel, why then did Netanyahu think Hamas were a threat and go into Gaza and invade it when they signed that agreement and they were no longer a threat because they did accept the state of Israel through signing that?
I think they are kind of related. I think we know more than I do about Abbas and why he is obstructing the going to the ICC. I don't think that there's anything that can be done short of some kind of universal jurisdiction being invoked, as Baltasar Garzón has done to figures in Chile against individual Israelis who are involved in war crimes. I think Colonel Ofer Winter is willing to go through that, but Abbas is preventing it, and he's given some kind of insane deadline for ending the occupation. I think he said ended by 2015? 2016. Okay, so, you know, who has to be the last Palestinian to die for Abbas's delays, to paraphrase John Kerry on the Vietnam War? I mean, and how long can he last in this position? Those are, it really, to make progress, the PA has to be dismantled and Abbas removed.
Why is it dragging this bit? Sorry to interrupt.
I mean, I'll open that to the floor.
But I've been reading, I'm always online on social media looking at Monday Rice and various other electronic various outlets for information, and from what I know is that Abbas has had pressure put on him, a lot of pressure put on him, mainly by America, to actually withhold from going to the ICC, and they've also apparently said that America have said they will not fund the PA, they will withhold funds from them, so as a way of getting them to stop them going to the ICC. And also, Abbas has been using, I feel, the Gaza lives as a bargaining chip to say, you know, let's see what we can get out of this before we actually decide to go to the ICC. Let's see if we can try and hold up and just play more games, basically.
Right.
Gaza lives, I feel.
You know, you look at the structure of the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority. 1 out of 4 people in the West Bank rely on the Palestinian Authority's salary, and they're heads of households. That means everyone. And then you have this little, you know, gang around Padiko, who are the oligarchs close to Abbas, who control the bulk of the economy in the West Bank. So there's a lot of leverage for the U.S. And Europe and the EU to play with Abbas and prevent him from doing that, because when the salaries stop coming, you have a revolt, and the revolt could lead to a revolt against the PA. The PA is actually pretty poorly armed. I've seen some of the fights in Nablus when there are fights over like electricity bills. You know, there's always clashes because the whole structure is just is rotten to the core. And a lot of times you'll see PA security forces pick up rocks and throw them back at the rock throwers because they've run out of tear gas, they've run out of bullets. Also, these are guys who were actively throwing rocks in the Second Intifada, so they can turn at any minute. But you have like a house of cards, and Abbas just doesn't. His goal is to prevent it from collapsing because it means, I mean, that's his ass. Hamas has repeatedly, I mean, you've heard Mishal especially repeatedly say that he would recognize Israel along 67 lines. But one thing that even Abbas won't do and that Hamas won't do is recognize a Jewish state. And that's the demand that emerged. It was actually Tzipi Livni, who was an aide to Ariel Sharon, when she was an aide to Sharon, who conceived the idea of demanding that Palestinians recognize a Jewish state, knowing that they could never do so because it would permanently compromise the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel and mean the refugees could never return. And so always to offer to make this a bedrock condition of negotiations would extend the negotiations. The world, you know, the U.S. can be frustrated with the Palestinians for supposedly not recognizing Israel, even though the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist in 1988. So for the first time, this demand was put to the Palestinians under the Kerry Framework Agreement, under the Obama administration, with the approval of the first black president of the United States, the product of multiculturalism, the legacy of the civil rights movement, demands that an indigenous occupied people recognize an ethnically and religiously unique apartheid state as legitimate. Obama is taking the fight to the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, and he's taking billions of dollars to the Jewish state of Israel and the Levant, also known as JSIL. And we need to make this point widely, that there's no way that an ISIL or a JSIL can exist without massive ethnic cleansing and atrocities. Why should the EU and the US support one and bomb the other? It just doesn't make sense. And why should the British government prosecute foreign fighters going to ISIL and celebrate foreign fighters going to fight for JSIL? These are questions that need to be raised publicly. And so this is why it wasn't good enough that Hamas recognized Israel as legitimate. It has to be recognized as JSIL. Let's take like the last batch. Let's see.
We have
5 minutes?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. So we have three questions, and I'll give 3, yes or no answers.
It's all privileged to hear your views. I wish that somebody
disinvited from the BBC today, so.
The only game in town really is a one-state solution. It's completely ridiculous actually talking still around a two-state solution. That's never going to be able to be viable in terms of Palestine. But in terms of the single state, one state, I think you said it would only be if it wasn't a Jewish state, if Israel basically was forced into accepting that situation. What do you think that we can do? And I'm speaking as a lawyer. What kind of strategies do you think civil society, countries like this country, other European countries, can adopt in order to make that a reality in our lifetime? I've seen the
You mean governments or civil society?
Civil society.
Okay. Okay, let's get these other two in real fast.
Because you made the point, somebody made the point that essentially that Israel is accountable is a freak society in some way. But in a way that perhaps is letting the rest of civil society on the hook, because there are lawyers there are others that are seeing daily colluding with the destruction of Palestinian civil society. So it can't just be, as it were, one section with all the fervent, rabid, religious nationalists.
Let's try to make these quick just because we're getting thrown out of here.
But there was a particular footage that Dr. Mustafa Beauty showed us at Loathing, a few weeks ago, which was in relation to the ambulance that calls up into the hospital, and then it's a envelope that goes on to that point in the hills. The ambulance workers that was really terrific. Marked maybe the same online hospitals with targets. I just understand at all say how it's able to come up with the same arguments about human shields and what we need now.
So, human shields, and we have another.
Just have a very quick comment, just to let people know, I work for a law firm called Loathing, and we are challenging the Department of Business innovation and skills in relation to its decision not to suspend 12 export licenses that it suspects could have been used in violation of international humanitarian law during Operation Protective Edge. So if anyone is interested in keeping up to date with that, then let me know. Yes. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, civil society's role is going to be played out through BDS, and there are new tactics. There's the block the boat tactic, which was based on tactics refined during Occupy Oakland. Oakland is one of the biggest ports in the United States. The group of activists and longshoremen from the Longshoremen's Union prevented the offloading of Israeli goods from an Israeli shipping company called Zim. That occurred also in Los Angeles and in Vancouver, and that's a model going forward. There's a society of architects here led by, I think, Abe Hayam. Yeah, Abe Hayam, who are putting pressure on Israeli architects who are directly involved in designing the occupation. And so it's really important to understand who your professional counterparts are in Israel and what role they're playing in the occupation. And to speak out. I mean, the medical journal Lancet published evidence of attacks on first responders and medical professionals in Operation Protective Edge, and they found themselves under attack by Israeli medical professionals. So they're volunteering their services for these atrocities, at least in a moral sense. And so the BDS battle is also being fought in professional fields. It's important to raise your voice not just as a citizen, but as a professional.
One state, two state.
The one state, two state, but you meant, human shields. Let me just address that. I mean, I met so many Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, who are used as human shields. And the treatment of them was just horrific. Mahmoud Abu Saeed was a 19-year-old kid I met him just as he gave his testimony to me in front of his house in Rafah, which had been comprehensively ruined. He collapsed time after time because he had been stripped naked, stood in front of windows, and his soldiers sniped over his shoulder to kill his neighbors. Then he was abducted and taken to an Israeli prison. This kid was 19 and his life was ruined. Go anywhere in the Gaza Strip in the border areas and you'll hear these stories. So to hear that Palestinians were used as human shields by Hamas to me is ridiculous. I mean, if I had heard about this, I would have reported it, but you don't hear about it. What you do hear about, however, that upsets Israel, and the Israeli narrative isn't just kill them all. That's not necessarily true. I think the dominant narrative is that Hamas is this totalitarian force that has taken over the Gaza Strip and that is oppressing people and ruling them against their will. And if we could just get rid of Hamas, then they would, make peace with us and be free. That's just not true. I mean, my secular leftist friends in the Gaza Strip were completely behind the resistance throughout the war, more so than ever before. And I will just close with a quick point, to help you understand that mentality. I'll speak for myself. If my country, and I'm a secular left-wing guy, I like to have a drink, my country was invaded and occupied by a foreign marauding army, and the liberals and the Democratic Party collaborated with that foreign marauding army and began serving as an occupation subcontractor. And the Tea Party and the Christian right rose up. I would stand with the Tea Party and the Christian right. I'd be out there with Pat Robertson on the battlefield. The support for the resistance in the Gaza Strip by regular people was almost total. The most revered man in the Gaza Strip this time was Abu Ubaidah. And it wasn't because they agreed politically, it's because the resistance gave them a sense of dignity and a sense of strength and a sense that they could fight back as the people in the West Bank, a right the people in the West Bank have been denied. And that's a right they're going to hold on to with tooth and nail, and it needs to be recognized, not just by Israel, but by this government.
I'm